Okay, so should be getting participants filtering in shortly. I'll give it a little bit and then get going with the announcements.
Sorry to ask a last minute question. Will we see them or will there be a chat?
So we will have a Q&A. I think as panelists, you can check on the bottom. There's a little participant bar, but I'll just give it one more minute or so. Let people come on in and then we'll get going. Okay, I want to, while we wait for some more people to join us, I want to just go ahead and get started so that we stay on track on time. For those who are with us, I have just a few announcements and then I will introduce our panelists. So hello, everyone. Welcome to day 4 of the Public Interest Environmental Law Conference. Thank you for coming to our panel today, Climate Education, Empowering Youth to Get Involved in Climate Action. My name is Miranda Barfield. I am a 1L PILC representative and I will be moderating this panel. First, for our attendees, please don't worry if you can't see yourself. This is a Zoom webinar, so all the attendees are automatically muted with videos off, and you'll only be able to see the panelists. Second, throughout the panel, if you have a question, please use the Q&A function rather than the chat function. All of our panelists will be giving their presentations, and then there'll be a Q&A session at the end where the panelists will answer your questions. Please remember to be courteous of all viewpoints throughout the presentation and the Q&A session. Additionally, if there are any legal professionals in the audience wanting to earn CLE credit for their attendance at the conference, we'll post a link in the Q&A to a Google document where you can register. Also, our alumni board, Friends of Land and Water, helps to provide stipends for students doing unpaid public interest environmental law internships. If you are interested in making a donation to help provide students with those stipends, information to do so will also be available on the document we link in the Q&A. Finally, we would like to acknowledge that the University of Oregon is located on Kalapuya Ilihi, the traditional indigenous homeland of the Kalapuya people. Following treaties between 1851 and 1855, Kalapuya people were dispossessed of their indigenous homeland by the United States government and forcibly removed to the Coast Reservation in Western Oregon. Today, descendants are citizens of the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde Community of Oregon and the Confederated Tribes of Siletz Indians of Oregon, and continue to make important contributions in their communities at UO and across the land we now refer to as Oregon. PILC would like to acknowledge the traditional homelands of the Kalapuya peoples in the Willamette Valley and express our respect for the tribal nations of Oregon. I will now introduce our panelists. Anderson Al Wozni, or Andy, is a PhD student at UNC Chapel Hill School for Social Work. Andy has been a professional public speaker and educator since graduating from Smith College with her MSW in 2014. Her work includes conducting continuing education seminars on the topic of Islamophobia in professional helping disciplines, such as social work, public health policy, and medicine. In addition to conducting workshops on this topic, Andy is an adjunct faculty with Smith College MSW, where she teaches a 10-week course on public welfare policy. Sarah Ruggiero is the secondary science specialist and outdoor school coordinator for Eugene 4J School District. She has taught environmental and climate science for over 25 years throughout Oregon, including the last 11 years as co-teacher, co-director of the Rachel Carson Academy, a career technical education program of natural resource management and environmental science at Churchill High School in Eugene. Excuse me. Sarah Stapleton is an assistant professor of science and environmental education at the University of Oregon's College of Education. Her areas of research and teaching include food in schools, science education, education for climate and environmental justice. Before joining the UO, Sarah earned her PhD in curriculum, instruction and teacher education from Michigan State University, earned a master's in education at the Harvard Graduate School of Education, and taught middle and high school science in public schools in California and the Gambia, West Africa. Thank you so much to all of our panelists for joining us today. And without further ado, I will now turn it over to our panelists.
So I guess I'll start. Hi, everyone. Again, thanks for the introduction, Miranda. And let me share my screen here. Okay, you see that? Okay, great. Here we go. Okay, so as you heard, I am here on Kalapuya Ilihi at the University of Oregon, and I'm excited to talk with you about climate education, and I'm really excited to see a panel on climate education here at the Environmental Law Conference. I've enjoyed your conference for a number of years now, and just thrilled that you invited us to the table as educators. So let's see. So I am on campus here if anyone is interested in hearing more about environmental education and some of our endeavors and initiatives and the work that we're doing, particularly with the environmental initiative right now. Let's see. Okay, so first of all, why climate change education matters. I probably don't need to say this to this crowd, but I think that this sign that was actually taken at one of our youth climate strikes actually here in Eugene really speaks to it. And I think about when I see the sign, it's like, yep, that's it, right? Everything is at stake. And we can't really, we can't continue without really focusing on climate change education and putting it in sort of in the center of a lot of what we do, particularly, I will argue, in public education. So obviously there's lots of problems, but when we talk about the education problem around climate change, we see over and over and over that kids are saying, we are not learning about climate change in schools. And we want to learn about climate change in schools. So what's going on? We want this. And so, and Sarah and I are going to both talk with you about some of the issues that we've seen here and we'll start to pose some solutions that we're kind of jointly working on with a number of other educators and students here locally, and that there's lots of work broadly on this globally, really. So first of all, and I know that this is familiar to most of you, right? So an indicator of this problem is the fact that our youth have found it necessary to take to the streets and make their voices heard about the fact that adults are not addressing climate change like they need to. We've seen the school strikes for climate. Increasingly, of course, Greta Thunberg was one of our first who started this movement and then became global. This picture in the right is a picture, again, from our Eugene School Strike for Climate. And I think that was 2019. It was maybe the last one that we had fully collectively before the pandemic. And then, of course, that center picture is our youth versus government trial that many at the law school are a part of, that of course our own Mary Wood has framed the sort of atmospheric litigation that's based on. And of course, many of these youth activists are from Eugene, from this area, many from Oregon. And of course, our Children's Trust is also local. So I feel great pride that we have so much incredible youth activism here in Eugene, where we are. And I feel like it also gives us a big responsibility to lead in all kinds of progressive ways in listening to the youth so that they're not just feeling like their voices are not they're going unheard, or they're being heard and told, okay, that's great, well, moving along, right? So how do we take them seriously and really make systemic change? A poll done in 2019 by NPR and Ipsos looked at adults and teachers, and one of the questions they asked was, should climate change be taught in schools? And one of the things you can see from this is overall, very, very large majority of folks said, yes, absolutely, climate change should be taught. Let's see. And then let me look at this really quickly, the overall, including, its impacts on our environment, economy, society. And then some small sliver said, schools should teach climate change exists, but maybe not potential impacts. And then just a small group of people, 10% overall, said that schools should not teach anything about climate change. And of course, this is larger. There's a Democratic and Republican split here, but even across Republicans, the majority think that schools should be teaching climate change. And only 17% of Republicans that were interviewed were said that it shouldn't be taught in schools. And so I think this is really important for us to keep in mind when we think about schools as a public space and a place where our kids come from bipartisan groups, that actually there is widespread support to teach climate change in schools. The same poll asked teachers, maybe why you don't teach climate change, and the vast majority said it's not related to the subjects they teach. A smaller group said students are too young. A number said I don't know enough about it, or I don't have the materials to teach the subject. And then only, small slithers, 8% and below, said I don't believe in climate change, or state mandates it taught at a different level. My school doesn't allow it. And so when we look at this, and I've talked a lot with Sarah and some teachers that we work with about this, it's like, oh, this is very addressable, right? Because to us, climate change is across all the disciplines that are taught in schools. And we can all think about how important that is to hear about climate change, not just in science class, but in social studies and in math and in language and all the classes that you could possibly take, actually. And so this is actually not discouraging. I think that this gives us a lot of hope that we can do this. Research on teachers and the teaching of climate change find that teachers tend to be afraid of parents or community backlash, first and foremost. And when I teach my students, who are mostly pre-service teachers, this is what I tend to hear from them. Well, what if parents are angry? What if the community is angry? What if my administrators are angry at me? Teachers also often feel unprepared, or they have a lack of knowledge to teach about it. It's not typically been included in teacher education. I'm changing this here, but it's definitely been it's a widespread problem in most places. We still, of course, have to look at teachers' beliefs and emotions about climate change themselves, particularly if they haven't been supported in their own learning about this. And then the ongoing need for teacher professional development will be very important to help teachers who are already practicing, have already gone through their teacher education, and need support in doing this work. So if we look at some key sort of effective principles for climate change education, Monroe et al. Did a literature review across a lot of climate change studies, and they found that climate change education needs to be personally relevant to the learners. It also needs to be engaging and student-centered, not surprisingly. And part of this includes deliberative discussions, allowing students to really wrestle with issues and not just be, didactic, just information throwing out there, but allowing students to really think about things. They need to interact with the scientific process, particularly if it's taught in a science context. And also they need to be allowed to help with designing and implementing school or community projects. In my own research, I have researched and written about climate justice education and centering justice in the work that we do in climate ed. And one of the things that I found from my interviews with youth, and this was a group of teenagers who traveled on a state-sponsored trip to Bangladesh to study about climate change impacts, I found that for them, they needed climate justice contextualized so that it's not just an abstract notion, but that it really sits in a place in a deep context so students can really wrestle with all the elements and the issues there. And we also call this place-based education, often in education. The teens, to me, emphasized how much they appreciated the human-centric framing of climate change. They critiqued the notions of the polar bear as being the icon for climate change and said, when we see people at the center, it really compels us in ways that maybe the polar bear has become sort of a numbing feature. They appreciate a focus on solidarity and power imbalances. Climate injustices are immense and great. As we know, the global south is deeply impacted in huge ways, and the people most impacted by climate change are the ones who contributed the least. And this goes both nationally here in the US, across all the layers of marginalization across race, across class, across gender. But it also is really exacerbated across nationality. And so these are compelling themes for youth who care about justice and fairness. And so these are things that we really need to center in our work when we think and teach about climate change. Helping youth see themselves, both in the problems and the solutions, is really important. So when I talked with teens, when they could see that they, even just by the very nature of being in the US, had tremendous environmental footprints, tremendous carbon footprints, that really compelled them to be part of the solution. They realized that they had a responsibility to this issue. And then this power of personal connection, this notion of knowing people who are impacted by climate change. And this is getting, sadly, easier and easier, particularly for us in the Pacific Northwest, where we have all been impacted by climate change pretty immensely and increasingly so as our wildfires grow each year. And I know in my own teaching, I've had students, we've started my climate activism class discussing ways in which students have themselves, their climate change stories. And it's pretty powerful and also really sobering that they all have them. And I don't think we could have said that a few years ago, but here we are. And so as sobering as that is, it's also encouraging from an education perspective, because it makes the issue so much more compelling for so many more people. And so we're seeing massive shifts through our social science research and the people who care about climate change that didn't used to be. So this is actually a really important moment for us to really move forward in mobilizing climate education. Just a few influences on youth climate activists. One study found that for youth activists, exposure to other youth activists has been really important for them. Greta being, of course, a key central figure. They called it the Greta Thunberg theory. And then they also associated this with a greater belief in collective action and the power of collective action. They did find that it's important that youth share the same political affiliations and identities with the youth that they profile. And so that's really important for people to think about their context, right? If they're working with youth from maybe conservative families, that they find conservative youth or youth from rural areas that can be someone who they identify with. And they also found, encouragingly, and maybe not surprisingly, that younger adults show stronger beliefs in collective advocacy than older adults do. And I think we see results of that, right? We see who's in the streets, we see who's doing this action work. Another study found that similarly, politicized social identity and perceptions of environmental threat and shared responsibility, feeling that collective guilt, were things that really pushed youth into becoming climate activists. So I would be remiss if I leave out this really kind of most important thing across a lot of social science research we're finding, and that is the importance of hope, and then the connecting the importance of action to that. And so basically there's lots of great books. These are all books I use in my climate activism course. I recommend all of them. A bunch of them are very new, actually, and Sarah Waquette-Ray, who wrote the Field Guide to Climate Anxiety, is actually one of our environmental studies doctoral graduates, who's now a professor. So she's the author of that book. Regeneration's a very new book that just came out in September that's excellent and encouraging. And All We Can Save is a book that has been used in a lot of professional development. It's selections of short stories from feminist and lots of women of color perspectives around the climate crisis. And it's very uplifting and inspirational. And so I really kind of recommend all these books as good sources for thinking about this work. And noting that over and over and over across research, we see that if you're going to, we should teach about climate action, climate change, first of all, but we cannot do it unless we include hope and hopeful, focus on solutions and how students can be involved in action, that those have to be there, because otherwise we put students into this place of despair. And we also see increasingly amounts of climate anxiety that is pretty high across our young people. And so we really need to do what we can to mitigate climate anxiety and move them into a place of hope and action. And we know that hope and action are sort of the elixirs for climate anxiety. So those have got to be there in whatever we do in any kind of climate education and any discipline that we teach this. Okay, and so as a teacher educator, I am very passionate about the importance of public education and the fact that education is the last major public bastion we have in the US, and we must do everything we can to support it, to support teachers, and to make it strong. And so how does change happen in K-12 education? Well, that's a complicated question, but I want to focus particularly on climate education. How do we make this change happen? How do we make climate change taught in schools? So a few possibilities. We can reform standards, and we certainly have. So for example, NGSS is the next generation science standards. Those were passed in 2014 in Oregon and passed in most states in various degrees. And they do include climate change education. Thanks, Miranda. But they're not in every grade level, and they only explicitly mention climate change starting in middle school. So I'm not quite sure that that is going to be our full solution, and also it's only science. And one of the things that we think very as in Sarah and some of the work that we're doing together with climate ed in the state, it needs to be multidisciplinary. It cannot just be in science classes. We can have proclamations at the country level, at the state level, at the school district level. You can also have curricular-based approaches with curriculum development and curricular distribution and access being free and available, and we're working on that too. Teacher professional development is another important area. I work in teacher pre-service education, and so that's a place where I am addressing this right now. And then also focus on school buildings and grounds, the fact that schools as institutions have carbon footprints themselves that we can examine and include in both our action and what we study with students. So just a quick few examples for you. At the state level, in 2017, Washington State created a budget proviso, so a funded measure for science education that emphasizes climate change, and it's called Climb Time. And they are doing a lot of really fantastic professional development with teachers around this. They work very closely with UW, and it's a very, very promising endeavor. And it was made possible because the governor, Jay Inslee, prioritized this and sort of said from the top down, we're going to do this. And so it was. And so that's something for us to think about here in Oregon. Our sort of critique of this is that it's only science, and we really think that multidisciplinary is the way to go here. Our neighbors to the south in California also have partnerships with K-12 schools and higher education through both the UC and the CSU systems, partnering on climate literacy for K-12 education, which includes pre-service teacher ed, in-service teacher ed, and K-12 lessons and support. So we're surrounded here, and Oregon needs to kind of get on the ball. That's what we're saying. However, in Oregon, we do have the first school district in the country that has created a climate justice resolution. And this is Portland Public Schools. And I will say that this is 100% the result of teacher and student activism. Period. This was not the school district themselves making this great decision. They were really, really pushed by teacher leaders and students to do this work. And I'm actually engaged in a research project right now with Tim Swinehart, who's one of the major teachers who started this, kind of telling sort of the rest of the story about what happened when the district took it over. It's not necessarily a great ending. Well, for now. Moral of this story is to really make sure that teachers' voices are heard and valued and honored. Here at the University of Oregon, I have created a class last year that's run 2 years now called Teaching for Climate Activism. And this is designed for people, it's education undergraduate majors and some master's students who are all future teachers. And part of this work is helping them think about how to teach climate change and understanding the research. And then they as part of their action, actually put on a teacher workshop. And so these are our flyers from the last couple of years. I'm sure you know Kelsey Juliana, one of our own great local youth activists, was our keynote the first year. And Tim Swinehart, who is the climate justice teacher in Portland, was our keynote this year. And just a few suggestions for future research and action within education or broadly, thinking about the role of climate change in elementary school. We don't have a lot of research here. How young is too young to talk about climate change? Thinking about climate change across the curriculum. I've said this over and over. I don't think I can say it enough that this needs to be in all of our subjects in humanities and social studies, and being interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary is really powerful and important. The inclusion of justice in climate change education is paramount. It's incredibly important. We should not do this work without centering justice. Also, it's really compelling for youth. And so there's many reasons to do it. And we just have to make sure that we center justice in all of this work. We need to think about the roles of schools in supporting social change and activism. For example, a lot of our school districts during the school strike actually forbade their students from walking out of school. And so the students had to lie about why they were going to be out of school, or their parents would say they had a doctor's appointment. And I think we need to think about the roles of schools as social institutions and the ways in which they support or try to impede this work. And then, of course, the roles of schools as institutions with carbon footprints themselves, the grounds, the buildings, the facilities, the school food, and transportation all being great as in large sources of carbon footprints. Okay, and so it's my email address. Happy to hear from people if you have questions.
I have just a quick announcement. So it looks like, unfortunately, our Q&A function isn't working in the webinar, but hope is not lost. You can go ahead and send us an email if you have questions, and we can bring them to the attention of the panelists afterwards. So that email is, let me just make sure I have it right, but I'm pretty sure it's askpilk@gmail.com. So that will be the way that you guys can send us your questions. And also, another unfortunate announcement, our third panelist, Andy, had a personal emergency come up, so she won't be able to join us. But so Sarah, either Sarah Stapleton or Sarah Ruggiero, if you want to take any more time, feel free, but we'll have some extra time at the end for discussion. So thank you so much.
Great, thank you. Okay, I feel like Sarah lines up my piece pretty beautifully. So thank you, Sarah Stapleton. So I'm going to share my screen as well. Can everybody see it okay? Okay, awesome. So I am here as a teacher of 25 plus years, both in and out of the classroom. When I say in and out, meaning traditional classroom, conventional in the classroom for about probably 2 or 3 years, and then outdoor education and sort of more experiential education for I don't know how many before that. So it was all kind of overlapping. But anyway, currently, I have been in the classroom for the last 25-ish years, and am now working as a science specialist, secondary science specialist. So that's middle and high school science for Eugene School District. And then I also coordinate outdoor school for our 22 little elementary schools in town. So that's my background. And I was hoping to put a link to the slides, which maybe I can just share with Miranda and they can broadcast it out if you'd like access to the slides. But as part of it, there's a hyperlink here. If you are interested in reaching out to us, the Oregon Educators for Climate Education, either with questions or interest in support in joining our work, that would be awesome. The form is a Google form. You can just fill it out and include your information. So all are welcome. So I love the theme of the conference this year, A Different Normal, which is very, like home, it hits home for me as a teacher that was teaching, online mostly, and then hybrid, and just quick pivots all the time, rethinking how we do education. And it was both, tragic and crazy, but also hopeful in just kind of rethinking really how we do this thing called teaching. And so there's been a lot of innovation just in terms of like how we teach and our approaches to teaching, which has been, as I said, challenging and enlightening though. So I love the theme, and I'm reminded that like the question for us was, how do we inspire, or what are strategies for getting youth involved in environmentalism? So I want to kind of just start with like, my experience of teaching climate change. So it's been kind of an evolution or a continuum. The first probably 10 years, which was all middle school, both in Eugene and in Portland Public, was all kind of about like, what is climate change? How do we know it's human caused? Like, what does it look like? Do we even know what it's going to look like? Because at the time it was sort of, like based on a lot of models, and we're seeing trends and, increased storm intensity and frequency, and could that be it? So it went from this kind of scientific investigation and tracking, and is it real? And I did have a lot of pushback, even in Portland, from families, that were like, well, are you going to teach the other side of climate change? And I'm like, what is the other side of climate change exactly? And sort of challenging those critical thoughts around, if you've got some information, it would be awesome if it wasn't happening, or if it wasn't being exacerbated by human behaviors. So I sort of went through this transition of, is it real? What is it? And even the like evidence versus the natural cycles, there's this very common, thought of, well, it's the position of the sun and this thing called Milankovitch cycles, which was always a very big, haha, I got you. But in the last number of years, it's become my own educational experience as teacher has been like, I don't have to convince kids anymore. I don't have to, and I recognize like we're in Oregon and in Eugene, Oregon of all places, right? And I also, in the last 10 years, have been teaching in a place called the Rachel Carson Academy, which is, I meant to mention that. So it's a career technical education program, a CTE program. It's a 20-year program where we've been teaching natural resource management and environmental science to high schoolers, and partnering with community partners. And the beautiful piece about that program, that educational experience that I've had at Churchill High School, was that I teamed up with a social studies teacher. We had a totally integrated curriculum. So it never occurred to me to not include the social science aspect as part of the environmental science piece, right? So it was just this kind of natural web of information where kids could see the human impact with the science. So we went from, is it real, to now it, not only the evidence is clear, but we're experiencing it, right? And the things that I really noticed a big difference with, in terms of student interest, like the question is, how do you get students involved? And Sarah Stapleton spoke to this, that moment, like when you can show that there's a justice piece to it, that other people, or that people around us, our neighbors, are having very different experiences, whether in our same community or within the world around us. So ideas of climate refugees. As I began to teach about heat islands about, I guess it was probably about 7 years ago or so, that we really started to dig into that as part of our curriculum. In terms of the environmental justice part, kids really latched onto that. The disparate impacts of, storms and drought, how that impacts different people differently. That's a real big motivator. And then of course, add on to that, like Sarah mentioned, you know, kids in the West in our town, we were choked out, like our whole school year got delayed, for Pete's sake, for like several days just because of the smoke. So we couldn't have school. And so when kids, you know, that immediate impacts piece, everybody has their own climate story. I would encourage you to think of your own, like when you think of your own climate story, what is that moment for you? Is it your own personal experience with smoke, or is it, you know, drought, or, oh my gosh, the things that I used to grow in my garden don't grow here anymore, or whatever it is? We all have, I think, our own personal climate stories. And so I think that's really important for us to think about. And then on top of that, though, as part of my continuum of teaching this is that hope piece, right? That Sarah also spoke to, because I can tell you, I would start my AP environmental science class every year with, I'm going to pummel you to some extent with some really bad news. It's going to be pretty, you know, pretty relentless in many ways, but I really like kept mentioning, like, you know, reiterating that there is hope, and we are going to, you know, talk about the solutions or possible solutions within each content area, or within each subject area. So I think that piece became more in the last 5 years, you know, as I was teaching climate change, which was really just kind of, you know, threaded throughout almost all of the subjects within environmental science or environmental world issues, our 2 courses. It really was, it was permeating all of the pieces in terms of, like, you know, endangered species, like why, you know, what's the impact there, and so on. So the hope piece, I found to be really heartening, and I think the kids did as well, that, you know, it was going to take some creative, comprehensive solutions. You know, it needed to be student-led, and that gave them hope. Oh, actually, I want to just, before I cover that up, so that picture here on this slide is today's newspaper, literally, like it was just this morning in the Register Guard. The kids on this cover, this was the front page of the Register Guard newspaper. So those were some of the students that I work with, actually, including my own daughter, strangely, is in that picture. And they marched out, and that was completely student-led. And it was with kids that I work with locally, called the 4J Climate Justice Team. So it is giving them, you know, it's that's student-led, that voice. And I can't tell you how important that is in terms of any education, is just to empower kids, right? And also have it be creative. You know, I'm a science teacher, but I think those really creative minds are going to be some of the ones that come up with the most significant solutions. That's what it's going to take, is creative solutions globally. So that's kind of the background, right? And then this is kind of, you know, why we were asked to speak, and I'm grateful for the opportunity. So in the last, well, in 2020, actually right before COVID hit, literally we had this conference, and these are pictures of my students and my teaching partner at the conference, that was organized by other teachers in my district, who are part of our Oregon Educators for Climate Education, our team. They coordinated this K-12 kind of summit to come together, students and teachers, to talk about what are we doing about climate justice, climate education, you know, in general in the school district. And the resounding voice of students was, it's not enough. And, you know, teachers got up and spoke and said, hey, this is what I'm doing in first grade and second grade and all of these, you know, up through K-12. Oops, I hope this isn't there. And so we had, you know, it was just pockets, right? It was just pockets of passionate teachers saying, this is what my unit looks like, or whatever. And it was, we sort of started to look at it as a more holistic picture of there were lots of holes. And this is in Eugene, Oregon, right? And so if it's not broadcast, you know, consistent and robust in a place like Eugene, you know, that I don't know, if it doesn't happen here, I'm like, it's unlikely anywhere. I don't, you know, so the voice of our students was loud and clear. And so even, so this conference happened, and then we went into COVID, and there were students in that year that came out of that conference that kept wanting to meet and move forward with, like, what can we do? How can we have more climate education, at least in 4J? So those students, they were mostly seniors that graduated in the crazy year of COVID. They presented to the Oregon Department of Education, the state science supervisor of ODE. And then the ODE people, the Department of Ed people, invited our students to speak at the Council of State Science Supervisors. That's a hyperlink there if you ever wanted to check it out. But that's basically like all of the science supervisors for every state. And our students presented this beautiful case of, we need climate education more broadly, but this was also just science educators. I also have this link here because that was last year when they presented to the state science supervisors. This year, our students, the 4J climate justice team, spoke on the City Club of Eugene, which is just a little, you know, local, well, I mean, it is broadcast through KLCC, it's widespread across our state. And they spoke about the importance. It was 4 students from all of our high schools speaking about how they really wanted, you know, climate education across the state, at least, and certainly in 4J. So you can listen to that. I thought it was pretty inspiring to hear their voices. So out of that student voice, we came up with, you know, we listened, we heard them as educators. And so several, I would say, I guess it was 3 of us, started to reach out to U of O, Sarah Stapleton. I think that's how it happened. Sarah, correct me if I'm wrong, but in any case, I don't know, it just kind of grew into a larger coalition of educators, mostly in 4J at the moment, but also in Corvallis and up in Lake Oswego. We have a significant partner, and then a broad kind of, that's our steering committee, but we've had broad interactions across the state, so Eastern Oregon and so on. So we're asking and aiming for legislation. We want to make it a state law, much like Senate Bill 13, the tribal history, shared history, and more on that in a second. I'll tease that out a little bit. But the central goal, legislation, multidisciplinary. So I mean, it's great that it's in science and the NGSS, the Next Generation Science Standards. But if it's only a 2-week unit in a science class in 10th grade, like, what about everybody else? And what if that teacher isn't very well prepared or knowledgeable in that particular subject? I mean, full transparency, if you're, you know, you sort of tend to gloss over the things or do a, you know, not as deep a job if you're not well trained in the subject. So we're looking for multidisciplinary, across content area, K-12 climate education legislation. We are assembling, and currently, like yesterday, I spoke to the Oregon Education Association, our Oregon union, teacher union. We're looking for a broad coalition with tribal and BIPOC foci and voice clearly in the center as well. So you can kind of see, you know, some of the pieces. We want it to be place-based because it's very different what climate education and climate change looks like in the Willamette Valley versus the Rogue Valley in Southern Oregon versus Eastern Oregon out in Pendleton. It's going to look real different to farmers and ranchers. It's going to look real different along the coast, right? And so we want it to be very place-based so that people, you know, so that we're hoping, our hope is that would kind of break down those barriers of politicizing climate change. Like, what does the change in climate look like in Eastern Oregon, and how is that impacting families and economies and so on? So we feel like that's an important piece. We're hoping for it to be sustainable with sustainable funding. That's a tricky one, honestly. And I got to admit, like as a teacher, I feel like there are a lot more questions than answers I have in terms of like, how does the legislation actually look? And so that's kind of why we're reaching out for collective community voice. I'm going to just kind of quickly go through these slides, not to bore you with details, but just wanted to kind of give you some ideas of like the specific ideas that we've generated. And this is not just in 4J with the 4J educators. This is voice from across the state, various partnerships that we've reached out to. So organizing through our local education service districts, and they're called ESDs if you're not in the education world. Comprehensive, I mentioned that. Accountable, that's the piece that's a tricky one, is that if the teachers aren't held accountable, how do we know that they're actually teaching it? Because it could just be a unfunded mandate that's not necessarily enforced. And that's a tricky part, right? We hope to model it on other recent education legislation, which I think was a motivator for us to see like, okay, this could be done. And that's how it was done, and how important the tribal history, shared history, or the Holocaust education. We feel like the professional development has got to be in place and robust. And I feel like that's kind of where my expertise can come into play in terms of an education piece. But the legislative piece is a little overwhelming to me, not going to lie. Learning concepts and standards aligned at each grade level, multilingual instructional materials that are based on, the populations that they're serving. We're hoping to link it to those career technical education programs, much like the Rachel Carson program. They have a natural resource management pathway at the state level. And so maybe we can tap into that a little bit more. And then also having it be real collaborative across different agencies in the state, Indigenous tribes, longhouses, and councils, and then ODFW, Department of Fish and Wildlife, and so on. Okay, so those are some of our ideas that are specific in the legislative piece. And so these are the questions and wonderings, and I would call your attention to that little blue highlighted spot that says, want to help? Because I'm assuming that there's law folks in here that, might be well-versed in policy and legislation and all that stuff that I have no idea about. So there's kind of three buckets, right? The legislative piece and the process, like how to do that. What's in the bill? What does it even look like? We have this, draft legislation that it is just in draft form. Lots of input, welcome, in that regard. And then also sort of what's in the bill in terms of, should we try to tie funding to this bill? That's tricky because people don't like to support things that cost money typically, but then how do you fund it? So that's just a question that we still have, frankly. And then also how will it be implemented? In terms of rolled out, getting the ESDs on board, what does the professional development look like, and having it be well funded, at least in that regard. So there are some partners and partnerships that we've been reaching out to. Our Children's Trust, we're hoping to connect with soon. We've been playing email tag. Okay, so that's kind of it. I don't know if we have, it sounds like we don't have question and answer opportunities, but there's my email if you would like to reach out. That's my personal email, because I am here in the role of steering committee member of the Oregon Educators for Climate Education steering committee. And so it's separate from my school district job, but obviously closely tied. Oh, and lastly, sorry, there are a couple, I did include at the end just some of our learning concepts that we have as part of, I'm not going to read through those. Hopefully, if I share this out with Miranda, or you can contact me and I can just share the slides. It's linked to the web. It's published to the web, so you can access it more easily. But there are the learning concepts that I wanted to share as well. And I can put those back up if you'd like. Okay, thanks for having me.
Yes. So I'll ask Jesse to check if we have any questions and send those over to me. But I do have a few questions that I can throw your way, and we can chat a little more. So both of you touched on this, but maybe we can just think about it a little more. So you mentioned the importance of hope and some of the climate anxiety that a lot of us are facing. And so I was curious, how do you balance fear and hope when you're teaching youth about climate change?
Do you want me to go, Sarah? I'll start. That's a great question. I have to say, there have been a number of days where I would be teaching about the impacts, and I would look out at my seniors who are about to go out into the world, and they just looked kind of beaten down, or they would straight up say it, just it's, we got to be careful to not say it's on you, good luck with that. Like that's a piece that we hear pretty consistently, especially from our high school students. They're like, look, y'all kind of messed it up and we can't just come sailing in and fix it for you. And so I think that looking for, like, having them look into what the little changes they can make. In fact, on the front page of the Register Guard this morning, one of our climate justice team members, Sahara Valentine, she's a student at South Eugene, she was quoted, which was an awesome quote. She said, I just had to look at what little things I can do. And so, to not overwhelm, that's the first thing. I also think that climate activism is a little bit misinterpreted or misunderstood. Maybe, like, you don't have to take to the streets. Like, some people that's not their jam. They're not going to be like, yeah, well, I'm going to go make a sign and bang a drum. Like, so looking for ways that kids can take action that isn't like activism, or looking at activism in a different way. Like, it can be in the food choices you make. It can be riding your bike to school. We're planning a bike caravan with our climate justice team to, like, make riding to bike cool, or riding our bikes to school cool. So there's little things that kids can do. And then also, I'll never forget, I had a final project in one of my, it was my AP environmental science class. And this kid the project is like, what was one thing you wish you learned more about, and or what would be one thing that you could dig more into? And his whole thing was how important voting is. He's a political science student at U of O, as a matter of fact, right now. And he was all in on the environmental issues of everything that we discussed, and was really heartened by it all. But he knew that, like, the most important thing that kids could do, and these were like seniors in high school, many of them turned 18 while in my class, and he basically was just like, vote. That's the most important thing you can do. And so I think that it's just like getting kids to understand what those hope actions can be, right? And what's your specialty? Are you an artist? Can your activism be art? Are you a writer? Can your activism be writing? To go into science writing or environment, like, if you're, what is your skill and your passion, and then to tailor it to that. That's what I would say.
I agree with everything Sarah just said. And I will just also add that one of the things that climate change education communication research has showed us is the importance of knowing your audience, right? And so thinking about who you are communicating with, right? Is it kids? Where are they? Where do they live? Are they rural? Are they urban? Are they suburban? Are they, and really tailoring your message to your audience, right? Because we need to communicate in different ways about climate change to different people, and different things are going to resonate with different kids. I'm currently thinking a lot about impacts on rural Oregon, of the fact that our droughts are causing massive hay and feed shortages for livestock and horses right now. And this is really stressful for people in a lot of our rural areas. And so there are lots and lots of ways to tailor it, and to be really mindful of that. And then I love what Sarah said about activism. It's been a kind of a thing for me to really help people kind of deconstruct the term of activism and think more broadly about it. And I tell my students that, education is activism, right? Like helping and having talks, like talking across difference with people, talking about climate change is activism. And so thinking really broadly about what we conceive of as activism, right? Writing is activism, communicating is activism, talking about it, educating others, changing things in your own personal life, and is, as Sarah was mentioning, is a form of activism. And so there's many, many different layers and levels to do action, right? To be involved in action. And then the other piece of that is there's been a kind of a long-standing back and forth in the literature and different folks about like the difference between individual action versus collective action. And like, no, at first we kind of way overshot the, like, it's all about individual action for a very long time in environmental education. And then we completely pendulum shifted over to like, it's all about collective action. And now we've kind of gotten to a point where we're like, actually it's both. And it's both because as we're working together to try to make collective action, like Sarah and I are both working on this climate education work. I mean, our group meets once a week. Constantly, we're spending a lot of time on trying to make this happen, but we also realize that the legislative session is not going to happen until next year. And so this is also a long-term thing. We're looking long forward. And so in the meantime, we're also doing all kinds of other things. And so to keep us going and help us feel like we are both part of this collective that is trying to make systemic change, while we are also individually doing our own parts. And so it's that connection of the both that are really important for everybody in feeling agency.
Yes, excellent points. One of my questions was, you guys pretty much answered it, but it was kind of like to address that powerless feeling. And so that seems to be what you both are getting at, is small steps or large steps in your individual life and recognizing the power of the larger movement as well. So that is awesome. Thank you. Let's see what else I've got. So I was wondering, I think this might be more for Sarah Stapleton, but it could definitely be for both of you, so feel free. So in some of the statistics you shared, you mentioned that that a big barrier for teachers is they think that climate education or climate change is not necessarily relevant to the subject that they teach. And so I was curious how we can change the perception of maybe it's not relevant to other subjects beyond environmental science.
There are lots of ways to do this. I know Sarah has some good ideas too. I think just like proclaiming this from the rooftops over and over every time we talk about climate change and climate change education, that we are very careful not to relegate it into science education or make assumptions that like, oh yeah, we're talking about science education, because that's happened for way too long. And it's a bad thing. You can't, moving the onus onto science teachers is not okay. And also not even all the science disciplines feel the same kind of. So like one of the things I try to work with my pre-service science teachers on is like, okay, physics teachers have a role to play here and thinking about the physics of climate change. Chemistry teachers have a role to play in thinking about the chemistry of climate change, and not just like, oh yeah, earth sciences, environmental sciences, and oh yeah, biology and that ecology bit, and then boom, that's it. And so we have to be careful, because if we don't always frame it as a very multidisciplinary place, it's going to get really relegated into like tiny little spots, like Sarah said, like 2 weeks in this one unit, in this one class, in this. But yeah, just I think being very explicit every time we talk about climate change, that we are not talking about just science education, that we're talking about all the areas, because as we know, it is so multidisciplinary. And actually science education is incredibly narrow in its approach in terms of thinking only about the causes and solutions and the technical pieces. But the policy, of course, is all sitting into social studies domain, and you can't extricate those really. Sarah, did you want to?
Yeah, I love that. Yeah, and that's such a good point about the sciences, because it does, even though it's a part of the science standards, it really is relegated to the earth science class. And yeah, but I also want to just give an example that actually one of the students on our team spoke about on the City Club of Eugene show. She said that when we were sort of asked or asking, I can't remember, about how it would look showing up in a math class or some other discipline, and she gave a great example. She said, I don't really like math. I don't really care about math. I'm not like tuned in, but one day my teacher gave me this math problem about an oil spill, and all of a sudden she like perked up and was like, oh wait, what, we're going to calculate something about oil spills? And like she was in. And that's not going to be the case for everyone, but that's a real simple little change that you can do, have problems that are associated, or larger project-based problems that are associated with climate change. Of course, there's all sorts of well, I mean, there's an opportunity if you're a writer out there, to create young adult novels about climate change, and or have writing, prompts about that, and do critical readings. So it's like that's a little tricky, but if we can provide the resources for teachers, and that's another piece. Gosh, I didn't mention that. Quick little side note, which is kind of an important side note, actually, is that we don't want this to be another like thing that we're layering on to teachers, right? Like, I can hear my colleagues, myself included, like, what, we have to do another thing mandated by the state that's unfunded, that's just like kind of the realm of public education, right? And so we don't want to have that be our thing. We want it to be, well supported in terms of professional development, but opportunities for integration, right? Like, what could it look like in kindergarten? Oh, it means that we're going to go out and observe changes in the leaves, or, just appreciations of nature. What does it look like in 5th grade? How does that incorporate with outdoor school and the lessons that they get from outdoor school? So that just sort of appreciation of nature and observances of change in elementary school, and reading stories, and it's just integrated into math problems, and it's integrated into storylines. And then, of course, the higher up you get, middle schoolers love to dig into problems and issues. And so how could those be incorporated into existing curricula, and offering teachers the resources, the well-vetted resources that we're working to collect and vet, ultimately, to offer, and then with the professional development. So.
Awesome. Thank you. This one, I'm curious, you mentioned how everyone has climate story. I'm curious if there's any stories from either your students or maybe personal anecdotes that resonated with you of kind of that spark of activation with climate justice that you'd be willing to share.
Yeah, so this fall, I asked my students, this is the first time I'd done this, and my students in my climate activism class range from people who've cared about climate change and known about it for a long time and have been, really sort of part of the choir, and then those who really don't know much about it at all, because one of the great failings of public education, because we have not included climate change, is a lot of our students haven't studied it long. Oh, and here's a failing of the UO. This is a big one. When I ask my seniors to raise their hand, how many have studied climate change, like pretty centrally in classes at the UO, out of 32 this year, I had 5 who had, and everybody else hadn't had climate change in any single class they had at the UO. Sorry, I'm getting upset about this, but that's ridiculous. That's ridiculous. And the ones who raised their hands, the 5, were science heavy folks. They were science majors, or they're folks who've taken a lot of science classes. And so that is shameful, and shame on us at the UO. We need to change that. And I'm working on the environmental initiative, and I hope that we do change that immediately. But back to my story. So when I asked the students to explain to tell their climate stories, we kind of did it at a round robin. We were actually on Are we on Zoom? Yes, we are on Zoom because I was in COVID quarantine. Oh, what a year it's been. And they just eat one by one, share their stories. And what really struck me was that a number of our students from Southern Oregon said that they lived in a place with the worst air pollution in the state, and that some of them have been dealing with air pollution issues since they were in 5th grade. And these are now seniors in college. And one of them said her earliest memory of being really impacted by climate change was that they were going to do an outdoor production that she was in a drama thing over the summer, and they'd worked really, really hard, and they'd planned, and they were going to put on their play, and then it had to be canceled because of air pollution from fires. And this was in 5th grade. And then she said, in every summer since then, I rejoice when it's a clear air day and we can actually go outside safely. And I mean, that's really, I just can't stop thinking about that, actually. And so those of us closer to Eugene were deeply impacted by the holiday fire. And that was, and that came up across lots and lots and lots of narratives. But it was our students from Southern Oregon who really have been sitting with us for far longer. And it just has already deeply impacted their childhoods. And yeah.
Yeah, and same. The most, we're working with local kids, so the fires and the air quality, and just, the impact of what brings, like, what kids do. We're like, get kids outside, but just kidding, not today or for the rest of the week, and so that's a big one. Kids that love to go outdoors and camp, and they spoke about those impacts of camping in the later parts of the summer. But honestly, the biggest story that stands out to me, there were two, one from a kid from North Eugene, and then also, actually, yeah, both of them from Churchill. They all were talking about their fear for their younger siblings, like that almost gets me choked up. Like, I can't even imagine that, like, a high school junior or senior is worried about their little brother or sister and, like, what it's going to be like for them. I'm just like, oh, God, that's significant. They shouldn't have to worry about that. Yeah, so that's a big one.
And I forgot to mention, I actually had a handful of students already out of only 32 who'd had to evacuate many times their homes throughout the years because of fires, and at least one student who lost a home.
Wow. Yes, it's very, very real for those folks. Yeah, and I'm from California, so definitely California, it's similar. It's rising temperatures, sea level rise, and the wildfires for sure. Okay, so also curious to know if there are, like, the greatest barriers that you're facing in trying to increase climate education for kids, whether is it the funding or maybe something else, perception, that type of stuff, and maybe how that can be addressed.
I would say that the elephant in the room in K-12 climate or K-12 education is that climate education is just not even part of what educational administrators, most teachers, like education writ large, educational researchers think about. Like, Sarah and I are very much in the minority of educators who put this front and center in the work that we do. And even in our own departments, even in our own, it's really, really frustrating that this issue has been so relegated to so few people and has been ignored for so long by K-12 education as a sector. That I feel like is the biggest, it's going to be the biggest hurdle, because basically educational administrators are like, to them, it doesn't even come to the level of test scores. And it's just, I cannot comprehend the lack of, just the short-sightedness of that whole situation is really frustrating.
Yeah, I agree. And I think it is, that is also partly based on capacity, right? Like our own capacity for, educators to take on more. I mean, I hate to say it, but especially like right now, even the most caring, we have a climate justice team in 4J for educators, and it is sparsely attended. And we don't blame them. We keep having our monthly meeting, and teachers are just taxed. And so to add to that, I honestly think that is the biggest barrier. And I think that a way to address that, money isn't everything, but teachers, if they are valued and paid for their professionalism, like and I'm not saying like, oh, raise our wages. It's just, which would be nice, but it's more like if we can pay them to do the professional development in a way that like other companies pay their employees to go and get trained. And, I think that would be a huge one. The trick though, of course, is where is that funding coming from? It's public school, right? And so it's publicly funded. And so, that's something that we're working on in terms of like how to get it sustainable funding. And, does that look like through grants for professional development? Like that's a whole realm that is new to me. But I do think that, it's teacher capacity, like Sarah said, willingness of administrations. And then also if there was some sort of like, funding tied to it, like this is worth it. This is important. We value your time. We value your professionalism and your role. I think those would be, a start.
We have in our group joked and not joked about using a gas tax or a carbon tax and used that to fund the climate ed measure. So law folks, there's something that we love your counsel about.
Yes, good ideas. So I think the final kind of thing to wrap up, just kind of what's next, what should folks in the audience or maybe watching this after the fact do to get involved, spread awareness about the importance of climate education?
Well, if you have law skills and legislation skills, particularly in getting things passed at the state level and interest, we'd love to have you contact our OECE group with suggestions for how we pass this climate education legislation. And just generally, supporting teachers is a big part of it in all the many ways that we can as citizens, as parents, as, all the way around, knowing that this is an incredibly difficult situation for the profession. And we've been leading up to teacher shortages for a long time. It's not just COVID. So this is something that, we need to start valuing teachers in big ways, all of us collectively as a society. And so I don't know, all those things, and keeping your ears out and for ways that you can help and support. And if you have skills and knowledge and capacity and you can help teach or help, support teachers in doing this work, that's great. Any and everywhere, having conversations with people about this need.
Yeah, I don't really have anything else to add other than I like that last part, especially just have conversations, with your kids, with your kids' teachers, with your colleagues, I think that the more we can bring it into the spotlight, the better, personally.
Great ideas. Well, thank you both so much for taking some time to join us and talk with us today. As I think I mentioned at the beginning, we're recording and this will be posted. If anyone wants to refer back, feel free to email me. I'll be in touch emailing me. You can email me the slides and we'll distribute those out. But thank you both again and have a great rest of your Sunday. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks so much.
Have a great day.
Bye.